Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert McCaw. I'm the National Government Affairs Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations, the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization. I'm really excited today because I'm going to give some of the highlights of CAIR's new midterm election exit poll survey of Muslims. The report is it's titled Candidates and Constituents, American Muslim Election Victories and Voter Attitude Survey. It's for the 2018 midterm. This survey, in part, was worked out with Jetpack, a civically minded organization from Massachusetts that looks to train Muslim community members to get out and run for office, and of course, CAIR. And one of the earliest findings we found after the election was that 55 Muslims we've confirmed so far won electoral victories in 2018, most of them in the midterm. You know, a couple races people won in 2018 in like April or May if it was a provisional election or, you know, someone running for school board, but the majority of victories came just 2 days ago during the midterm election. Very excited. We keep on getting reports, so we actually think the number is now above 60 Muslims have won their races in 2018. CAIR has its own goal of training up to 200 Muslims to run for an elected office in 2020. We know that over 100 Muslims this year ran in 2018. We're excited. So I'm going to jump right into the information, but click the link under this video, on top of the video, wherever it is on Facebook. Check out the report, get the data for yourself. It's really exciting. For a policy geek like me, I'm always into the numbers. So whenever I get some funding to do an exit poll, I want to hear what's happening with Muslim voters. So, you know, one of the top line things was, of those registered Muslim voters who we surveyed, who picked up the phone, 95% actually said they voted in the election. Now, there's a little bit of bias on who picks up the phone and who doesn't when you do these surveys, but it still indicates that there was a really high turnout of registered Muslim voters in this election. It's going to be CAIR's job moving forward to 2020 just to make sure there are more Muslim voters out there. 78% of voters primarily voted for Democratic candidates in the election, while 17% were voted for Republican Party candidates. And those two numbers are a continuing trend that we saw in the 2016 election, that we saw in the 2012 election presidential. We really do see hovering around 70–80% of Muslims continue to vote for Democratic candidates, and anywhere between 12 upwards to 20% of Muslims vote for Republicans. And there's some reasons for that. So what we found was 46% of Muslim voters, they considered themselves to be liberal on social issues, while 35% considered themselves to be conservative. And similarly, 43% of Muslim voters considered themselves to be fiscally conservative, 40% considered themselves to be liberal. So when we break out the numbers, though, this is what we find really interesting. 26% of Muslim voters who primarily voted for Democratic candidates, they actually considered themselves to be socially conservative, and 36% of those Democratic voters considered themselves to be fiscally conservative. So what we still see is a large contingent of Muslims who vote Democratic still see themselves as being conservative. And that's why the Republican Party really needs to do a better job of weeding out bigotry and trying to court Muslim voters, especially as Muslims can tip close elections. The Democrats, they keep on reaching out to Muslims. They have a better game plan. I promote competition. Fight for the Muslim vote. We also saw that 68% of Muslim voters thought that anti-Muslim sentiment in the last year, Islamophobia, that it had risen, while just 17% actually thought it had decreased. And when you look at those numbers, again, the Muslims that voted for Democratic candidates, 78% of those people, those Muslim voters, thought that Islamophobia had risen, while conversely, 33% of Muslim voters who primarily voted for a Republican candidate thought Islamophobia had increased. So Muslim Democrats think Islamophobia is rising more than the Muslim Republican counterparts who think it's actually, it hasn't risen as much or decreased more. So lots of interesting information there. 53% of Muslim voters have become more interested in politics since the 2016 presidential election, while 34% maintained the same level of interest and 13% became less interested. And that's understandable for that 13% because if the spotlight is on your community and honestly a lot of mud is being slung at Muslims in American politics, that can be disengaging. But really, in this heightened atmosphere of Islamophobia, that really ignited a fire in a lot of American Muslim voters. The majority, 55%, are just now more interested. And also, 55% of Muslim voters became more actively involved. So they weren't just interested, they're getting out there and they're getting engaged in civic-minded issues in their local mosque, on the campaign trail. And when we broke down what is the primary type of involvement of these 55% of Muslims, like how does their activity most demonstrate itself? 20% of those Muslims said that they were now primarily giving money to political parties or candidates or other social campaigns. 25% had primarily donated their time to volunteer. 18% were actually like giving their own expertise. If they're a web developer, they're building a website. If you're like me, you might volunteer and do communications, all sorts of things. And then 37% just said that they were contributing to civic-mindedness, to campaigns in another form or fashion. I'd really love to break down that 37%, maybe in the next survey. So what we did find was more interesting that Muslims that voted for Republican candidates were more likely to donate their money, while Muslim Democrats were more likely to volunteer and give their time. So that's another interesting takeaway. There are these partisan divides, and they actually manifest in how people behave. 15% of Muslim voters are actively involved in their mosque or Islamic center. 26% are somewhat involved. 27% are not very involved. And 28% are not involved at all. That's a category of American Muslims we call the unmosqued. They might be active in their communities. They identify as being Muslim, but they're not necessarily going to the mosque, and that's not how they're demonstrating their religiosity or their civic-mindedness, or maybe they're forming their own religious communities. And then 4% just weren't sure how to answer that question. 49% of Muslim voters who primarily voted for Republican candidates were more likely to not be at all involved in their mosque or Islamic center in comparison to Democratic supporting counterparts where it was 23%. So also, there's a difference in between Muslim voters and which parties they vote for and how they behave and how they contribute their time and their mosque attendance, different priorities. This survey, it surveyed a little bit more male than female, so 63% of the respondents were male, while 37% were female. And what we actually found is that American Muslim women are more likely to vote for candidates in the Democratic Party than their male counterparts, and they're also less likely to vote for Republican parties candidates than their male counterparts. There are a lot of great graphs, information in this survey. We have some really in-depth statistical profiles that I encourage everyone to look at. I just gave some of the highlights. There's a lot more information in here. And we're also going to do a follow-up report next week that delves not only further into our exit poll survey, but we're going to have that final list, hopefully, of the total number of Muslims that won elections in either the midterm or 2018. And also, we're going to do some interviews with some winners of these races, some losers on how they can, win next time, and what type of strategies and activities that American Muslim community organizations like CAIR, like Jetpack, have been putting out there to make sure that Muslims are running for office and that the Muslim community is just civically engaged. So thank you for taking this time to watch this video. If you have any questions, go on CAIR's website. Our email's right there. Our phone number's right there. We're a community organization. We put out information and surveys like this with your support. So call us, ask questions. Also think about donating to make more things like this happen. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. See ya.